return to work as soon as it is safe to do so. And I want to ask him two specific questions. He will know that firms with more than 5 employees are obliged by law to carry out risk assessments on safety. Can I ask him whether he plans to ensure the publication of these risk assessments to give confidence to workers? And secondly, on enforcement of safe working, the HSE is operating on substantially reduced resources. Can I ask what the Secretary of State is going to do to ensure the guidelines are enforced so that all workers can feel safe?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, may I also take this opportunity to welcome the Right Honourable Gentleman to his new role. We've already had 2 very constructive discussions, and I hope that's the tone in which we will have our future interactions. Look, he raises an important point. Look, we both agree that we want workers in our country to feel confident that they are safe when they're returning to, and that they're returning to a safe workplace. There is work that is ongoing in terms of the consultation. Obviously, I don't want to preempt that, but he makes some very important points, and of course, he's always welcome to write to me, and I will look at what he says very carefully.
Ed Miliband.
Well, I thank him for that answer, and I hope that at the earliest opportunity he'll come to the House to make a fuller statement on these matters. I want to ask him about another aspect of the lifting of lockdown, which is financial support for businesses and workers. Does he recognise that there will need to be a second phase of financial support for those businesses that will have to stay closed for longer, including an extension of the furlough scheme with more flexibility for part-time working? And secondly, on the hospitality sector, which he knows is facing very challenging times, could I urge him to look favourably at the proposal that has the support of over 80 of his own backbenchers to extend business support grants up to £150,000 of rateable value? This would make a difference to tens of thousands of pubs, restaurants and other businesses that are the lifeblood of our communities.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows that we have provided support for the hospitality, leisure and retail sector. There is a 100% rates holiday for all businesses in that sector. We're also making £25,000 grants available to them, and I can say that in the grant scheme, the £25,000, the £10,000 grants, as of last Monday, £7.5 billion had been paid out, so I hope he will welcome that. With regards to wider measures that he talks about, we of course keep everything under review, and I will look at anything that comes forward.
We now go across a rover and up to Drew Hendry. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I also add my welcome to the Right Honourable Member for his new position on the Labour front bench. Mr. Speaker, a recent poll by the Scottish Chamber of Commerce found that 48% of Scottish companies will run out of cash within 3 months, with 64% identifying shortcomings in government support schemes. So does the Minister agree with Sir George Mathewson that far from helping them to bounce back, loan schemes will not even allow businesses to survive, and that the only option is to write off the debt and convert these loans urgently into more accessible grants?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say to the Honourable Gentleman, for whom, of course, I have an enormous amount of respect, is that one has to look at the sum total of what the government is putting forward. He will know that the job retention scheme, there are around 4 million people who are being furloughed through that. There is support available through grant schemes already. I talked about that in my response to the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite. And, of course, it's important that we support businesses, and we will continue to do that.
We now have a substantive question from Chris Green. Secretary of State, Chris Green.
Mr. Speaker, I announced the new Vaccines Task Force on the 17th of April, which will expedite efforts to research and produce a coronavirus vaccine. Last week, thanks to the UK Government's financial support of £20 million, the Oxford vaccine entered clinical trials in humans, and I can update the House that as of today, 601 people have taken part in that trial. We continue to talk to Oxford to understand its manufacturing needs, and colleagues will be aware they have announced a collaboration with AstraZeneca to ensure manufacturing capacity in the UK.
Chris Green, over to Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British scientists are working with partners around the world to develop treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's just as important we take the same collaborative approach to manufacturing to ensure that wherever treatments are developed around the world, they're made available in Britain and to people right across the world as soon as possible?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend does raise an incredibly important point, and of course we are absolutely committed to working with international partners in tackling the pandemic, ensuring the UK is both contributing to and indeed benefiting from efforts around the globe. As my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has today confirmed £388 million from the UK towards a global £8 billion target for research and development into COVID-19 at the Global Coronavirus Response Summit, which the UK is co-hosting.
We now, I call Minister Amanda Solway to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Craig Williams. Minister Solway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his question. We're engaging with businesses, business representatives, organisations and unions to get a shared view on how workplaces are made as safe as possible for when people return to work. We will work with industry and other key administrations to help develop an understanding of how business can adapt to a world where restrictions may last for some time.
We go across to Craig Williams. Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome my honourable friend to her place. Can I ask particularly about tourism and hospitality, Montgomeryshire being a rural countryside which is built for socially distancing tourism, but the industry will need some support in terms of putting together the new normal and new way of working our pubs, our hotels and our countryside pursuits and industries. So what work we're doing to get that sector deal on its feet.
Thank you. As the Prime Minister said, we want to get the economy moving as fast as we can, but we refuse to throw away all the effort and sacrifice of the British people and risk another major outbreak. We will be relying on science to inform us, as we have from the beginning. We will also be reaching out to build the biggest possible consensus across business, industry and all parts of the United Kingdom.
We now go across to Andy MacDonald. Andy MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government gave trade unions just 12 hours to respond to 7 consultation papers on a safe return to work. The entire country wants the government to succeed, but this is not how to build confidence or trust. The proposals talk about what they expect employers to consider and say social distancing and hand washing should happen where possible to help, with insufficient attention being paid to PPE. Taking the necessary steps to protect employees is not a matter of expectation or of guidance, it is the law. So will the Minister confirm that COVID-19 risk assessments will be mandatory for most businesses, that they will be made public and registered with the HSE, and given the lack of capacity for inspections, the workplace health and safety reps are involved in the settling of assessments, then their implementation and enforcement, and that they'll be able to assist in non-unionised supply chain companies.
Minister.
Thank you. We are engaging with businesses, business representatives, organisations and unions to come to a shared view on how to make our places as safe as possible for when people return to work. And I can assure you that we are also involving Public Health England and the Health and Safety Exec.
Minister, we have a question from Andrew Griffith, a substantive question. Minister.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK Space Agency, working with NHS England and the European Space Agency, has made £2.6 million available to close market ideas to manage pandemics. A new fast contracting process will ensure swift development. The agency is also working with the UK Research and Innovation to explore how drones can support health services.
Andrew Griffith, going over to Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I join my right honourable friend in thanking the space industry for their help with the crisis? Would the Minister agree with me that investment in the UK space sector has a vital role in growing the UK economy? And could she confirm that programmes such as GNSS and Skynet 6 are moving ahead at pace?
Minister.
Thank you. The honourable member is absolutely right. The growing UK space sector employs 42,000 people and contributes £300 billion to the world's wider UK economy by providing satellite services on which many industries rely. The UK Space Agency continues to investigate the requirements, design specifications and costs of a UK GNS capability and is working closely with the Ministry of Defence to support activities under the Skynet contract. We're working hard to develop a UK space strategy to generate further economic growth across the country.
I will now call Minister Quatang to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Sir Edward Lee. I now call Minister Quatang.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is doing everything at its disposal to support businesses through the crisis and beyond. The department is maintaining an ongoing dialogue with key stakeholders representing the country's small businesses. The FSB regularly participate in the Business Secretary's twice-weekly call and regularly engage with my department on a number of issues relating to COVID-19.
We go over to Sir Edward. Sir Edward Lee.
The best way probably to help small business in rural areas like Lincolnshire is to beef up broadband. That's long term. But in the short term, would the Minister accept that the best way to help business is let them do business, not subsidise them to close? I know we have to help vulnerable people, but it's not going to help the vulnerable in the long term if we crash the economy. So is the government working full pelt, obviously consistent with proper social distancing, to get business back to work?
My right honourable friend is quite right. We want to focus on getting business back to work. But these lockdown measures were introduced to protect lives. Relaxing the measures, we feel, too much would risk damage to public health, our economy, and all the sacrifices that we've all made. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, said last week, it is incredibly important that we create environments that are safe to work and learn in. We will adjust lockdown measures when the scientific advice indicates it is safe to do so.
We have Laura Forrest with a substantive question. Minister.
With your permission, sir, I will group this question with questions 15, 16 and 17. My department is supporting businesses through the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. In addition to these programs, we are providing grants for small businesses linked to their business rates status. And we are scrapping business rates this year for those in the hospitality, retail and leisure sectors. We have also set up a package of support which will offer £1.25 billion for high growth firms, and today we are launching a scheme providing bounce back loans of up to £50,000 to small businesses.
We go over to Laura Forrest. Laura Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I represent a number of businesses in Newbury specialising in renewable energy. A secondary effect of the pandemic has been a collapse in demand for fossil fuel. When the economy begins its recovery, what support can my honourable friend give to clean energy suppliers to ensure a greener and more resilient energy infrastructure?
Minister.
Thank you, sir. My honourable friend is quite right. We are absolutely committed to net zero and will continue to support the development of clean energy. The fourth Contracts for Difference allocation round will take place next year, bringing forward new renewable electricity projects and creating further demand for the many businesses across the UK that supply them. This unprecedented package of support for businesses that we've mentioned earlier will help ensure businesses in the clean energy sector that they can contribute to driving economic recovery after this pandemic.
We go across to Marcus Fish. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can government please give local authorities and LEPs real-time access to sector-level information about the furloughs and redundancies, and back ambitious enterprise and incentive schemes for them to help businesses recover and transform after the virus?
Minister.
I think my honourable friend raises a really important point. I think in terms of the flow of information, that's absolutely key to dealing with the crisis. And I'm very happy to meet with him to discuss the specifics of his constituency businesses. And I'll raise the issues of access to specific data with my right honourable friends, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and also the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions.
We go over to Elliot Colburn. Elliot Colburn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've had a number of businesses from Carshalton and Wallington get in touch who weren't eligible for the first round of grants, such as those in shared offices and our lovely park cafes. Does the Minister agree with me that councils should make use of the discretionary fund announced over the weekend to help these businesses through the pandemic?
Minister.
Thank you very much, sir. We've recognised that there are businesses in shared workspaces in particular with relatively high fixed costs related to rent payments, for example, and they haven't been able to benefit directly from these grants. And I know that my honourable friend has raised this issue with my department. As a result of his lobbying, on Friday, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, announced additional funding to local authorities administering the 2 grant funds. This will help support businesses that are currently out of scope, but I strongly recommend his input in this, and I think local authorities now can provide grants to small businesses in a variety of shared workplaces.
We now go across to Raymond Chiste.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local businesses in Gillingham and Rainham have asked me to ask the Minister to clarify what help is being given to those self-employed business owners and partners that earn over £50,000 threshold. Some of these businesses cannot furlough any or only some of their staff, and business interruption loans still need to be paid at a later date. Can the Minister clarify what support is available to those that fall into this category?
Firstly, I'd like to clarify that our current position. We prioritised helping the greatest number of people as quickly as possible. And in order to target that support at those most in need, the government has chosen to cap the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. Now, those not able to access this scheme may be able to access other wide-ranging measures that the government is providing, designed to support businesses across all sectors during these difficult times. And I'm very happy for him to engage with the department and myself on this very issue.
I now call Minister Nadhim Zahawi to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Hannah Bardell. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I, with your permission, would like to answer this question together with question 19. My department is working closely with the Treasury on the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and the wider government response. In developing the scheme, Mr. Speaker, the government has prioritised helping the greatest number of people as quickly as possible.
Go over to Hannah Bardell. Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And whilst the additional flexibility is welcome, the Jobs Retention Scheme does nothing for those outside its arbitrary limits, like my Livingston constituent, stonemason Jason Hoffman. He has a small limited business and makes up a modest salary with legal and tax-efficient annual dividends. In Jason's case, he doesn't qualify for the scheme, he isn't eligible for universal credit, and he can't furlough himself because he couldn't bid for work and his business would collapse. So how many small businesses like Jason's will be destroyed before this Conservative government finally listens and includes them in the scheme? And what comfort can he give to my constituent today?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, what we've tried to do, Mr. Speaker, is prioritise helping the greatest number of people as quickly as possible in terms of making sure that other people can be helped, including those who are self-employed, that a scheme for them is also available, and we've tried to do as much as we can through grants as well, through local government, including 617 million in discretionary grants for businesses who may not be registered for business rates, who can get that additional help, was announced over the last 48 hours.
We go over to Gavin Newlands. Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not entirely sure that the Minister or his Secretary of State is actually listening, because the truth is the coronavirus business loan schemes aren't working, in part because some lenders don't trust the government to stand full square behind their loan guarantee without potentially moving the goalposts at a future date. Loganair is just one of the many businesses in my constituency with an urgent need to access this scheme through an overly cautious and risk-averse lender. So what can the Minister and his colleagues in the Treasury do about this?
Minister.
I'm sorry the honourable gentleman feels that way, but his counterpart, Fiona Hislop, in the Scottish Government, who I speak to every week, as I do with Ken Skates in Wales and Dan Dodds in Northern Ireland on our weekly calls, thinks actually the schemes are working well. We have improved them as we've reviewed them and made them better, and we've launched the Bounce Back scheme, which is much simpler, 2 to 50,000, that can get money in the bank within 24 hours.
We have a substantive question from Clive Efford, Minister. Clive Efford to be answered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Profiteering in PPE is completely unacceptable, and I want to be clear that no one should be seeking to exploit this health emergency for financial gain.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a very disappointing answer, because this problem has been added to by the failure of the government to stockpile PPE, and there are numerous examples of people exploiting this situation. So it's only going to get worse if the government does not act quickly. So will he commit to legislating to take power to act against these operators who are exploiting this situation?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Competition and Markets Authority, Mr. Speaker, has already written to the small number of firms suspected of profiteering, and the Secretary of State has recently met with businesses and consumer representatives to discuss what further action might be necessary to address this issue. The vast majority of firms, Mr. Speaker, and I have to put this on record, are acting responsibly, and we have seen so many across the UK supporting the national effort to tackle COVID-19, such as Brewdog, Diageo, and hundreds of small operators across the country. But as I said, the Secretary of State keeps the option always open.
We now come to questions to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Minister for the Cabinet Office. I will first call the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to answer any substantive question that's been tabled by Graham Morris. Duchy of Lancaster, Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 1, 2, or rather bracket questions 1, 2, 3 and 4 together. Every NHS and care worker must get the personal protective equipment they need. That is why we've appointed Lord Dayton to lead the national effort to boost PPE production and also to support the scaling up of engineering efforts for small companies capable of contributing to supplies.
We go over to Graham Morris. Graham Morris.
Mr. Speaker, a large number of UK companies and consortia came forward with offers to manufacture and supply personal protective equipment, including the Protecting Heroes Community Interest Company and manufacturing plastic visors for face masks. However, in the weeks after the pandemic began, how many of these offers didn't receive a reply for weeks at a critical time, resulting in some businesses selling vital PPE equipment abroad? And indeed, I'd like to ask the Minister, what were the reasons for the delay in processing and responding to such offers? And has the government now established a more timely and efficient system for doing so?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. We have received 12,789 offers of help with the provision of personal protective equipment, and 10,436 of those who have made those offers have now been contacted. Of course, I'm sure the House will appreciate that many of those who make offers of help, well-intentioned and generous, are making offers of help for personal protective equipment that may not be appropriate in health and social care settings, and we must ensure that we have appropriate PPE in appropriate settings.
We now go across to Mark Eastwood. Mark Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been assisting manufacturers within Dewsbury, Murfield, Kirkburn and Denby Dale to register as potential suppliers of PPE on the gov.uk portal. And I'm pleased that these businesses are now being responded to by the Cabinet Office. Could my right honourable friend, obviously just confirmed how many have registered on the site nationally, but when could my right honourable friend confirm when they are likely to start receiving orders for PPE, the ones that have registered?
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the work that he, along with so many others, have done in order to ensure that generous offers of support can be processed efficiently. As I mentioned, we have 10,436 organisations with whom we've been in contact, but specifically when it comes to UK manufacturing, there are 201 manufacturers with whom we're in touch at the moment, 180 of whom are qualified to provide PPE, and 22 of whom are going through the technical product review necessary in order to ensure that their personal protective equipment is appropriate.
We now go over to Gary Sambrook. Gary Sambrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the number of offers of help from UK manufacturers to produce PPE is high, unfortunately, many simply won't be able to meet the medical standards required. What help can the government give to those companies who wish to play their part in this national effort?
Grateful. Sorry, forgive me. Again, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the efforts he and his constituents are making. It is the case that specifications of the type of personal protective equipment required in health and social care settings has been shared by the NHS and by Public Health England, but it is also the case that companies are in conversation with the Department of Health and Social Care about what more they might be able to do to augment those who are not necessarily operating in those settings.
Go over to Nigel Mills. Nigel Mills.
I thank the businesses and also John Flamstead School in Amber Valley who've been making a PPE for healthcare providers. Would you agree we're going to need UK manufacturers to keep making this equipment for the long term? Would you therefore be able to relax procurement rules and allow these people to have some longer term contracts so they can get maximum efficiency in producing this equipment?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend makes a very important point. We do need to show flexibility in the way in which procurement operates, particularly in order to ensure that we have domestic production in the future upon which we can rely. And my right honourable friend Lord Dayton is leading the work in this area.
I now go over to Shadow Secretary of State, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues have made important points about shortages of PPE. Those who look after the sick and the vulnerable deserve our protection, and getting PPE to them is all of our priority. The Prime Minister said last week that as part of coming out of the lockdown, face coverings will be useful. As the Minister knows, in Germany and France, it is now required or advised to wear face masks on public transport and elsewhere. So can I ask the Minister, as the government looks to announce plans to ease some of our lockdown restrictions, how many face masks suitable for wearing by the public are currently available, and what work is being done with health experts to ensure that the face coverings that people are using are sufficient quality to stop the virus from spreading?
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for her questions. She is right that there are other European countries which are prescribing face coverings, particularly in public transport and in other settings where a number of people congregate. We follow the scientific advice, and there is a clear distinction, as I know she knows, between the sophisticated type of face mask that would be appropriate in a surgical or social care setting and the sort of face covering that can be used by individuals in order to shield others, because it's important to recognise the wearing of these face coverings afford no protection to the individual, but properly worn, they can be a contribution to making sure that others are protected from the aerosols, from the droplets that all of us might, when we cough or sneeze, be responsible for producing. And it's why Lord Dayton and my right honourable friend Lord Agnew are working together in order to ensure that we can increase domestic production of just such face coverings.
Rachel Reeves.
I thank the Minister for that, but it is of huge concern that he lacks clear answers to the questions that I put, especially given the ongoing fiasco with getting PPE to health and social care workers. And so I ask again, how many of these face masks for public use are currently available? And other countries, Mr. Speaker, are ahead of us. France has increased production and procurement to around 8 million masks per week. The Japanese government is sending masks to 50 million households. So can I ask the Minister, what is the government doing to ensure that masks are distributed to all those who need them? And given that the government was slow to engage the UK textile and manufacturing sector in the production of PPE for frontline workers, what is the government doing to ensure that production of masks by British manufacturers is increased, looking forward to what might come next?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Lady again makes a series of important points. In terms of numbers of masks that have been distributed overall, from the 25th of February to the 3rd of May, we distributed 152 million masks, and just on the 3rd of May, we distributed 2.7 million masks. Now, of course, it is the case that for those masks that are appropriate in surgical settings, we do need to have a particular material, a melt-blown plastic, which is appropriate in order to provide the necessary protection for those wearing those masks. And we have been in touch with the specific suppliers of that type of material here in the United Kingdom. It is also the case that supplies of those materials tend to predominate in countries which have petrochemical industries, and we've been in touch with those, including in the Gulf, in order to provide it. But they're a very different type of material from the type of face covering that would be appropriate on public transport or elsewhere, and that is a very different exercise, and the numbers, of course, of which we can produce of those would be significantly greater, because we don't have a reliance, as I say, on that melt-blown plastic that can generally only be provided by other countries.
William Ragg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the key issues on this rather vexed subject is the transparency. I wonder if my right honourable friend would consider releasing the figures which he and other members of government are made aware of each morning on the Cabinet Office dashboard to show stocks and quantities of PPE set against demand.
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. It is the responsibility of all of us to do everything we can in order to ensure that we have visibility on the need for PPE. That is why NHS trusts and others report on their stocks and the additional requirements that they have. It's also why we have ensured that across the resilience fora that we have in this country, which are responsible for the distribution of PPE to more than 58,000 settings, we've seen something like 57 million pieces of PPE distributed. But again, my honourable friend makes an important point about improving the visibility that we all have, and I will talk to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, about just that.
Paul Leather, substantive question. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My department and the Department of Health and Social Care have been working with a variety of UK manufacturers in order to increase the supply of ventilators to the NHS. We've placed an order with one in particular, Penlon, for 15,000 additional ventilators, and I'm pleased to see so many UK manufacturers and medical supply companies working so well together in order to ensure that we can increase domestic supply.
We go over to Derbyshire, Pauline Latham.
Can my right honourable friend tell the House how many companies have risen to the challenge to make the extra ventilators needed? Companies that do not normally make them, like Dyson or Rolls-Royce.
State.
Yes, of course. We've been working with, at the moment, 11 new potential or existing potential suppliers, but over 5,000 businesses have been involved offering to provide services, because, of course, when you're producing a complex machine like a ventilator, then you need to make sure that you source everything from the appropriate batteries, the appropriate valves, the appropriate other technology, and as I say, 5,000 businesses, including Rolls-Royce, have been involved in the manufacture.
We now come to Secretary of State, substantive question, West Streeting. Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will take questions 9, 10 and 11th together. From the 20th to the 24th of April, a full and constructive negotiating round took place, with a full range of discussions across all work streams. Our next scheduled round of talks with our EU friends will take place on the week beginning the 11th of May.
West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone will understand that we've left the European Union, and everyone would understand that the impact of COVID-19 might have an impact on the timetable for negotiating our future relationship. So why won't the Minister give businesses the reassurance they need, that if the government needs more time, it will take more time? Is it dogma, is it vanity, or is it paranoia?
Secretary of State.
Well, that's a helpful list of conditions which the honourable friend, the honourable member lists, but it's none of those. It's plain prudence. Were we to perpetuate our membership of the European Union light through the transition period, we would end up spending more taxpayers' money, which could be spent on the NHS. We would have to accept new EU rules that might constrain our ability to fight COVID-19 and to deal with other crises. And we would, of course, be, unfortunately and unfairly, trespassing on the EU's need to concentrate on other vital priorities.
We go over to Nick Fletcher. Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend inform my constituents in Don Valley whether the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to lead to an extension of the transition period?
Secretary of State.
I can reassure my honourable friend and the good people of Don Valley that the government is not going to extend the transition period at the end of this year.
We go over to Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Michel Barnier, the leader of the EU negotiating team,
has expressed frustration that the UK's negotiators seem happy to run down the clock to leave the transition with no deal in place at the end of this year. We've already heard repeated warnings of the perils of a cliff-edge Brexit, which could be calamitous for the economy at a time where business are fragile and crave stability. Will the Chancellor of the Duchy do the right thing by ensuring that his party does not bring about this calamity?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this issue. There have been cordial conversations and negotiations between our negotiator David Frost and Michel Barnier, and I would not want to prejudice those by making any criticism of Michel Barnier other than to say that he will negotiate hard on behalf of the Commission, but we will negotiate hard on behalf of the whole United Kingdom.
We go over to Pete Wishart. Pete Wishart.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case that what businesses want more than anything else is certainty that this government won't do anything to compound the economic difficulties caused by this pandemic? The government, of course, couldn't do anything to stop COVID coming to our shores, but it's in their hands to stop further economic misery from a disastrous Brexit. Does he agree that the last thing businesses need is more economic turbulence, and the certainty that they seek is the one that says there will be no deal Brexit and there will be an extension to let them recover from this pandemic?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the point he makes. There won't be a no-deal Brexit. We have a deal. That deal was legislated for in the House of Commons. And I think he is right. It is important that we give business certainty. I think one of the best ways of giving business certainty is recognising that we respect referendums. That is why this House has voted to respect the referendum that saw the British people take us out of the European Union. And I would urge him and others to respect the referendum, which made it clear that the people of Scotland want to stay in the United Kingdom instead of having the damaging uncertainty of an indie Ref 2 hanging over future investment decisions.
Substantive question, Naz Shah, Secretary of State.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Owing to an initial communication problem, the UK did not receive an invitation in time to join the 4 EU joint procurements, including on PPE. We will, however, participate in the EU joint procurement scheme on therapeutics that is soon to launch, and we will consider participating in future schemes, including any on PPE, on the basis of public health requirements.
We now go over to Naz Shah. Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has left the EU, but the NHS Confederation and other top health officials have warned that failing to continue cooperation would be a disaster for public health. Does the failure of working together over PPE equipment signal a new approach by the government that puts ideology before the nation's health?
Secretary of State.
No.
We now go over to Paul Blomfield. Paul Blomfield.
Mr. Speaker, it was good to hear reports this morning that the government is getting behind the EU-led international initiatives to find a coronavirus vaccine. So given this approach, can the Secretary of State confirm reports that the government are now seeking to retain participation in the EU's early warning and response system for pandemics as requested by the Department of Health and NHS providers? And will they look again at participation in the European Medicines Agency?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for making that point. We will cooperate not just with our European neighbours, but with other countries in the fight against COVID-19. He's right to say that the Prime Minister is joining the call today in order to ensure that we can support the effort to secure a vaccine. The effort to secure a vaccine is necessarily an international one. And we will, of course, look pragmatically at how we can cooperate with our European friends and partners. But participation in the European Medicines Agency would involve, certainly at the moment, the acceptance of the European Court of Justice's oversight, and that's not something that the British people voted to do.
Leila Moran, substantive question, Secretary of State.
As I think members will have appreciated, given previous exchanges, the government won't be extending the transition period. Indeed, Parliament has legislated to prevent ministers from agreeing to such an extension. The government will therefore continue to negotiate a new fair trade deal with the EU, the process which will conclude by the end of December.
We go over to Leila Moran. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A YouGov poll released this weekend shows that half the population now think that transition period should be extended, versus 35% who think the government should press ahead. The public know that kicking the economy when it's down, especially with a no-deal Brexit on top of a COVID crash, is in no one's best interests. And he said just now that there's a deal, but he knows full well that's the withdrawal agreement and not the future deal that will determine the trade relationship. No deal is still on the table. So can the Minister tell us, will the government even consider asking for a short extension to avoid a no-deal Brexit, or is it intent on putting ideology before pragmatism?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her question. This government always puts pragmatism first and the interests of the British people first. She mentioned a YouGov poll. There was another poll on the 12th of December last year called a general election, in which my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, secured a majority in order to take this country out of the European Union on the basis of the deal that he negotiated. The Liberal Democrats took part in that poll. I can't recall exactly how well they did, but it's certainly the case that they were not entrusted by the British people with the discharge of policy on our relationship with the EU.
I will now call Minister Smith to answer the substantive question tabled by Virginia Crosby. Minister Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've established a Cabinet Committee structure to deal with the health, economic, public sector and international aspects of the COVID-19 outbreak on behalf of the whole of the UK. Ministers from the devolved administrations are regularly invited to participate in these discussions and do so to ensure the highest level of coordination and effective working to tackle this crisis on a UK-wide basis.
Across to Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister? And can the Minister assure me that the level of cooperation will continue to ensure that North Wales and Ynys Môn are equipped with enough PPE, provision for our struggling care homes and vital testing centres? And can she assure me that there will be a UK-wide approach to the easing of restrictions and application of the 5 tests?
Minister Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for that question, and I hope I can give her such reassurance. I'm particularly grateful, of course, to the devolved administrations, and in this case, the Welsh Government, for their cooperation. And we will continue to work with them to respond to the pandemic, and that's in the interests of all of our citizens. We respect the competence of the devolved administrations in issues like health, and where appropriate, we will seek a 4 nations approach.
We now have a substantive question by Adam McRae. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, misleading information about coronavirus, whether it's maliciously intended or not, could cost lives. So the work to tackle false information is led by our colleagues in the Department for Culture, Digital Culture, Media and Sport across all of government. We're also working closely with social media platforms to help them remove dangerous, incorrect claims about the virus and promoting steps that everyone can take to reduce the spread of false information.
Go across to Adam McRae. Adam. Right. I will now move on. I will now call Minister Mercer, who's going to take a question tabled by James Sunderland. Minister Mercer.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll take questions 18 and 19 together. As part of the national COVID-19 response, Defence has supported NHS trusts in a variety of ways. We have distributed PPE and diagnostic equipment. We supported the planning, construction and staffing of Nightingale hospitals and provided service personnel to conduct testing at both regional and mobile testing sites. We established a COVID support force to assist wider government with 2,935 personnel from that force as of this morning, currently deployed to assist civil authorities.
James Sunderland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the challenging operational circumstances in which key workers have found themselves in recent weeks, what steps have been taken by the Cabinet Office to recognise those who have gone above and beyond the call of duty, and might indeed these steps manifest themselves into a campaign medal?
Minister.
We're carefully considering the appropriate way to reward and recognise those involved in the unprecedented response. There will be a range of ways to mark exceptional contributions once we are through the crisis, including consideration of how the honours system might play a role. Departments continue to consider existing internal mechanisms to reward individuals and teams, with the recent example of Captain Tom Moore being appointed as an honorary colonel.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure we all agree that the military bring a huge amount to our national effort, including manpower, but much more importantly, mindset and their can-do approach. Yet rather than use their skills to the full, too many Whitehall departments are still clinging to the old discredited ways involving layers of middlemen, questionable mega accounting and consulting firms and needless delays. For example, the Foreign Office put all their trust in the airlines and left thousands of our people stranded abroad rather than properly using the RAF planes and equally and more importantly their planning and chartering skills. So as the department responsible for procurement policy, will he get a grip not only to get my constituents home but also and to get kit to the NHS and to care homes, but also to ensure that we're much better organised to come out of the lockdown?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his point. And what I would say is that whilst today you have seen the military and the media, and particularly around testing and how we've stepped into to meet that challenge, the military's been involved in this from the very beginning. I mean, we mobilised a 20,000 COVID support force. Yes, we've got 2,500 people testing. We've got 4,000 people deployed at the moment. It's for other government departments to choose when to use us. We receive those demand signals. That produces a response, and we're only too happy to step up and help other departments where requested.
I will now call Minister Penny-Mordaunt to answer the substantive questions tabled by Angus Brendan McNeill. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister established new implementation committees to coordinate the COVID response. The committees are supported by the Cabinet Office Secretariat and meet regularly on all issues, including testing.
We now go across to Angus Brendan McNeill. Angus Brendan McNeill.
I can't believe, Mr. Speaker, and can I say firstly how sorry we are in Hilligan and Year to hear the concerning news from our neighbours in the Isle of Skye about the COVID outbreak in Portree. Over to the west with ourselves in the Hilligan and Year, we're an ideal area really with the lowest R rate to pilot a test, trace, isolate, and even more so with the kind offers of help from the world leaders in population testing, namely our neighbours in the Faroe Islands. So with that, and if and when the Scottish Government green lights this sensible pilot, will the UK Government also assist by perhaps using RAF training flights to take test samples on the half-hour flight from either Stornoway or Benbecula to the Faroe Islands?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that, and indeed all colleagues who have put forward ideas and solutions and shared good practice in the early weeks of this crisis. I'm sure the honourable gentleman's requests will have been heard by our joint minister with the Ministry of Defence, and of course Defence has stepped up in every case where they have been asked, and I am sure that they will do so to support testing wherever it is taking place, and the pilots too.
Minister, substantive question, Christian Matheson.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 21 and 20 together. Both the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Health Secretary attend a daily meeting with the Prime Minister. Testing and tracing are part of those issues which are considered in detail at that meeting.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that testing and tracing and tracking will be an essential part of our battle against coronavirus, and it will require tech and IT to support that. There have been concerns in the last few days about the allocation of contracts for this, and perhaps a bit of cronyism within Downing Street. So what safeguards will the Minister put in place to ensure that applications and the data that those applications use will be safeguarded and used solely for the purposes of defeating coronavirus?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Clearly, there are very strict protocols which surround any kind of procurement or any kind of pilot that might take place across any government department. Those have given us confidence in the past, and there is no reason why they shouldn't in the future. I think if the honourable gentleman has concerns, then he should raise them with the relevant minister and certainly the Cabinet Office. But those protocols are strong. They've stood us in good stead. We have transparency around these issues.
We now go across to Catherine McKinnell with a supplementary question. Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you. I'm pleased the government recognise the importance of testing and tracing to containing the virus. It's just one of the issues that we need to get right before we can safely reopen schools. Head teachers in my constituency are really struggling to support vulnerable pupils, particularly with free school meal vouchers, because the system used by the government's chosen provider, Edenred, is just not fit for purpose. Will the government urgently get a grip on this to ensure that at least our children get fed?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question. She is right that ensuring that we have the right testing and the right volume of testing in place is one of those 5 criteria for us being able to reopen society and ease lockdown measures. I know that there have been issues with the voucher system that the Department of Education has been looking at. If there are any remaining issues in the honourable lady's constituency, if she would like to flag them with me, I will take them up with the Department for Education.
It is the end of the questions. We now come to the statements. I call the Secretary of State for Works and Pensions to make a statement, and the statement is up to 10 minutes. Secretary of State, Therese Coffey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I will make a statement updating the House on the work of my department. First of all, I want to pay tribute to the civil servants in my department, as well as our contractors and partners who have been working tirelessly to provide help and support to those in need. They are the hidden heroes for many people in this country, and they should take great pride in their hard work and dedication to supporting people through these difficult times. Since 16 March to the end of April, we have received over 1.8 million claims for universal credit, over 250,000 claims for job seekers allowance, and over 20,000 claims for employment support allowance. Overall, this is 6 times the volume that we would typically experience, and in 1 week we had a 10-fold increase. The rate for UC claims appears to have stabilised at about 20 to 25,000 per day, which is double that of a standard week pre-COVID-19. I'm pleased that my department is standing up to the challenge. We have redeployed a significant number of DWP staff, about 8,000 so far, and from other government departments, about 500 so far, in order to process these claims. Our payment timeliness for universal credit is running at a record high. We've also issued almost 700,000 advances to claimants who felt that they could not wait for their first routine payment, and the vast majority of these claimants received money within 72 hours. Where possible and mindful of risk, we have also streamlined our processes. We will consider carefully learnings from this time in the response phase and whether any of them can be made permanent. We've also sought to make it possible for people to work from home and have already deployed 10,000 computers. We are now at a level of deploying 750 new devices a day to enable working from home and added to the IT capacity for remote users. However, where staff need to continue to work at the office, we are applying social distancing. Making sure our claimants and civil servants are safe is a key priority. From the 17th of March, we suspended all face-to-face assessments for health and disability benefits. We automatically extended awards for existing claimants that were due to be reassessed by 3 months, and will only undertake reviews or reassessments when claimants notify us of changes which could lead to a higher payment. Any claim made under the special rules for terminal illness continues to be fast-tracked, taking an average of 6 days to process these claims. From March 24th, job centres have not been open for regular appointments, but we have continued to offer face-to-face appointments in exceptional circumstances when claimants would otherwise not be able to receive support. Claimants can continue to receive support over the phone or through their online journals. All local job centres have been turned into virtual processing teams, prioritising advances and the registration and payment of new claims. We've also been pairing job centres across the country to support each other with processing, fully using the capacity of our network. This focus on the processing of claims has also meant that we stopped checking the claimant commitment regarding looking for and being available for work for 3 months. We do, however, want claimants to continue to look for work wherever they are able to do so. Ministers are working hard to ensure that existing vacancies can be accessed by people who have been made unemployed, and we will continue to support those people while they are waiting for the opportunity for work. We've created a new website to guide people. It's called jobhelp.dwp.gov.uk, and we have 58,200 vacancies advertised. While our IT systems worked, thanks to extensive work by the Universal Credit team, including our contractors, I know that some claimants experience significant delays in verifying their identity. Now, identity checks are crucial in reducing fraud risk, so we work closely with the Cabinet Office to substantially increase the capacity of the online Verify system, and average wait times are now below 5 minutes. Call volumes have also been extremely high, with over 2.2 million calls in one day at our peak. Recognising again the delays people are experiencing, or indeed not being able to get through at all, we turn this around with our Don't Call Us, We'll Call You campaign. A bolstered frontline team now proactively calls claimants when we need to check any information provided as part of the claim. This has been very successful in freeing up the capacity and reducing the time customers need to spend on the phone. Regarding other operations of the department, while we have redeployed staff, we've kept critical work ongoing in child maintenance and bereavement. We are monitoring our performance and will return staff to these areas if the response rate is unacceptable. On pensions, we have cancelled the pension levy increase, supported DC contributions through the job retention scheme, and worked with regulators to assist DB pensions and combat scams. I think it's worth reminding the House of our financial injection over £6.5 billion into the welfare system so it can act as a safety net for the poorest in society. We focused on changes that could be made quickly and would have significant positive impact. We have increased the standard rate of universal credit and working tax credit for the next 12 months by around £1,000 per year. We increased the local housing allowance rates for universal credit and housing benefit claimants so they now cover the lowest 30% of local rents. We also increased the national maximum caps so claimants in inner and central London should also see an increase in their housing support payments. I've been made aware of an issue that some councils have not made that adjustment in housing benefit, and my department is communicating to them all this week. Furthermore, across England, we had already increased the discretionary housing payment by an extra £40 million for this financial year. The 1.7% benefit uplift was implemented in April, ending the benefits freeze, and the state pension rose by 3.9% as per the triple lock, reflecting last year's substantial rise in average earnings. We have also introduced regulations to ease access to benefits. We legislated to allow access to employment support allowance from day one of the claim. We relaxed the minimum income floor so that the self-employed can access universal credit more readily. We've also made it easier to access ESA by launching our ESA portal for online applications. We legislated to ensure employees had statutory sick pay available from day one of sickness or self-isolation due to COVID-19. And I should remind the House that statutory sick pay is the legal minimum. We will continue to look at issues that arise, like we are ensuring that maternity pay is based on the standard pay, not furlough pay levels, and see what we can do quickly and straightforwardly to fix either unintended consequences or unforeseen issues, but it is not my intention to change the fundamental principles or application of universal credit. A significant project we have undertaken is to support MHCLG and the National Shielding Service by establishing the Outbound Contact Centre. Furthermore, we use this contact sector to proactively contact our most vulnerable customers who receive their benefits or pensions solely through post office card accounts. I want to thank the Post Office in helping us support this group of customers, and we've been able to provide contact-free cash payments by Royal Mail Special Delivery. And we were also able to signpost people to extra support from their local council. I can also inform the House today that DWP will stop any new benefit and pension claimants from using the Post Office card account from the 11th of May as we prepare for the end of this contract. Uptake of accounts in the last year has been exceptionally low, but in any event, given that the vast majority of people using Pocket we believe already have a bank account, the cost of the contract is poor value for taxpayers. Current customers who currently receive payment through a Post Office card account will see no change and will continue to receive payments into their accounts for the remainder of the contract period. We can use the HMG payment exception service for people who cannot access any bank account. I also want to thank the Health and Safety Executive for their work on COVID-19, which is an arm's length body for Great Britain and is sponsored by my department. They have been doing crucial work with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and Public Health England to provide guidelines for employers to adhere to once restrictions can begin to be eased. The HSE is working hard, along with local authorities, to enable work to continue safely in the sectors for which they are responsible. They have developed practical guidance on enforcing the law where workers are being exposed to unnecessary risk. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, my department is standing up to the challenge of unprecedented demand for our services, and we are getting support to those who need it. We will continue to work across government to help the nation get through this health emergency, and I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Jonathan Reynolds, who has 5 minutes. Jonathan Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for advance notice of this statement today? And can I add my thanks to the dedicated frontline staff of the Department for Work and Pensions for everything they have done and are doing during this crisis to make sure we can process the unprecedented volume of claims that have been made. I also want to make clear that I welcome the measures the Secretary of State has announced so far. The social security system we had going into this crisis was a safety net with too many holes in it, and it is good that the government themselves have recognised this. The questions I have for the Secretary of State today about how we can widen this net so that everyone who needs support gets it, and about the steps that will need to be taken as we move from response to recovery. Firstly, the government have significantly increased universal credit. People on legacy benefits, such as job seekers allowance and employment support allowance, have not seen a corresponding increase in their benefit. Over 100 charities have pointed out that this discriminates against disabled people in particular. When will these benefits be uprated? Secondly, there are now 100,000 families who won't be able to receive this increase because they are still limited by the benefit cap. The government say the benefit cap exists to force people to work more hours or move to cheaper housing, both of which are nearly impossible during the crisis. Almost every organisation, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies to the Resolution Foundation to the Child Poverty Action Group, believes it should be temporarily suspended. Does the Secretary of State? Thirdly, anyone who has been saving for a housing deposit or for a rainy day or for a substantial item could find themselves ineligible for universal credit because of those savings. Those people paid into the system when they were in work. Shouldn't it be there for them now? I don't believe we should punish these savers, and I believe these saving limits should also be suspended. Fourthly, the government says the 2-child limit exists, so people supported by Social Security have to make the same family choices as those who aren't. But this crisis shows how absurd that claim is. People 3 years ago could not have been expected to make family choices based on the likelihood of a global pandemic shutting down our economy. The government have suspended sanctions during the crisis, but the 2-child limit is effectively an 18-year sanction on the 3rd and 4th child in a family, and surely it should go too. Fifthly, and finally, those people who are eligible for support from universal credit will still have to wait 5 weeks for their money or take an advance that will then be deducted from future payments. But what many people don't appreciate is if you claim universal credit before you received your final salary payment, income means you have entitlement for your first month and effectively could have to wait as long as 9 weeks for any payment. Since introduced, the 5-week wait has been the single biggest driver of housing arrears, short-term debt and food bank use in the country. It should not exist at all, but in the crisis it is particularly egregious and it simply must go. Could I also raise a very specific issue with the Secretary of State? It has come to light that the universal credit regulations treat maternity allowance, which is received by mainly low-paid women, as unearned income, but statutory maternity pay as earnings, which are disregarded by the work allowance. And this could result in a low-paid pregnant woman being as much as £4,000 a year worse off. Why is this, and will it change? Turning to preparations for the recovery, can I ask the Secretary of State, as the Cabinet Minister responsible for the Health and Safety Executive, what conversations she has had with them about the process by which workplaces will be made safe when people are asked to return to work? When the lockdown began, most MPs were inundated with questions from constituents still in work, asking if their workplace sounded safe. Now that simply won't do for when lockdown ends. There must be a clear process agreed by the workforce and management, not least because to fail to do so would likely result in significant litigation. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this crisis has unfair terms what the UK's unequal and unfair labour market really means. While some people have been able to work from home on full pay, others have faced having to go into work and risk their health, or have lost their jobs through no fault of their own and will receive social security or sick pay set at just a fifth of the UK's weekly median income. For the 4 million British children growing up in poverty, living in poor accommodation and perhaps without the internet connections many of us take for granted, the lockdown will have a severe impact on their well-being. Many have likened our response to coronavirus to fighting a war. If that is true, then the aftermath should be equally so, with a renewed national effort to fight the inequality, poverty and insecurity that should have no place in this country at any time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman. Actually, welcome to his position. We are in an unusual place today, literally, as the honourable gentleman is appearing virtually for our first exchange as a statement. But we will be seeing each other again next Monday when we come to questions. In answer to some of several of his questions. So I think in terms of the legacy benefits, now I should stress that the increase to working tax credits and universal credit is only temporary until 12 months from when it was applied. There are two things here. One is quite literally, we have a digital UC system. And the working tax credit system, I understand, is digital. It is far more straightforward and was quick to be able to change that. Our older systems, the legacy benefit systems, are it would take, I understand, quite some time, and I'm talking about several months to get this to change in the process that we have. That's indicative, if I can give you an analogy of when we make the changes to benefits, that tends to happen about 4 or 5 months before the actual changes come through, because that is how long it takes our computer systems to work. I think there's a second point. The statutory sick pay weekly rate is about £95. The change to universal credit is about £94. We are seeing initially this for the first time people who we only anticipate and hope people will be on universal credit for actually quite a short amount of time while we go through this significant emergency. And to that end, it was, as I point out, straightforward to change that. Now, there are other benefits people or other things that people would benefit from, and that would include some of the work that we've been doing on things like mortgage holidays, also stopping evictions happening from people who are renting due to issues connected to COVID-19, as well as things like people who are on prepayment for electricity. Again, no utility supplier is going to restrict any supply due to issues at this time. In terms of the benefit cap, I did say during the statement that it's not the intention to change fundamentally the process or the principles or application of universal credit. I am conscious of the benefit cap, but we are still talking outside London an income potentially of £20,000 over the year being given to people, to benefits claimants, or £23,000 in London. I'm conscious that that could be something like a £25,000 to £30,000 sort of a take-home salary, effectively, after you took into account taxation and similar. So I do think it is not necessary right now to be changing, not necessary to be changing the benefit cap. I think what I do want to point out to the honourable gentleman, though, is that claimants may benefit from a 9-month grace period where their universal credit will not be capped if they have a sustained work record. In terms of the savings threshold, the savings threshold where there's no universal credit eligibility at all is when people have savings of £16,000. Now, the universal credit is designed to really help the poorest in society. I am conscious, again, if any changes were contemplated, it would have taken some time to process that. But we have decided to focus our efforts on those who are poorest in society. I should also say, Mr. Speaker, that if people have, like self-employed people, have saved money for taxation payments, and they are effectively going to be treated as business assets, so they would not be included in the consideration of, or would be deemed personal savings. In terms of the 5-week wait, as has been pointed out, again, there is no intention to change that. In fact, this is our biggest week in terms of the largest number of people who claimed. This will be our biggest payment week going ahead. I am aware of what the honourable gentleman said about people who got paid in the last month. So there is a phasing issue in terms of the calculation of universal credit payments that people would be entitled to in regards to the standard allowance, is my understanding. I do know that's a phasing issue, and it is one of the benefits of having the advance, which is there designed to actually spread a kind of an annual income over 13 payments instead of 12. So for people who are going through that right now, that would be my recommendation, that they should consider getting that advance, and as I say, the total annual payment would be spread over the year. In terms of UC regulations, in terms of maternity allowance and statutory minimum pay, maternity pay, I will look into that for the Honourable Gentleman, and I will write to him on it. I do know that quite a lot of consideration has been given to the different rates supporting those people in maternity, but I will write to him with that. In terms of the aspects of people only receiving statutory sick pay, I point out to the House that that is a legal minimum, but it is one of the purposes of the furlough scheme, that people were, instead of either being made unemployed or other elements, that there was this opportunity. Of course, if people are sick, then an employer is entitled to do the statutory sick pay. And I should also point out, in terms of those people who have been shielded and cannot go to work and can't work from home, then the furlough scheme can be applied straight away for them, and we are encouraging employers to do so.
We now go over to Aylesbury with Rob Butler. Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The extraordinary level of support my right honourable friend has described is certainly welcome in the Aylesbury constituency and is undoubtedly assisting thousands of households. And I join in paying tribute to all the staff, both in the department and in Job Centre Pluses, in making that happen. It would be helpful if my right honourable friend could perhaps describe the ways in which these unprecedented levels of support from DWP can help the owner-directors of small limited companies, many of whom have written to me, because they're mainly paid by dividends, and so they're not entitled to the assistance scheme for the self-employed. I think it's fair to be clear, these are not multi-millionaires. These are hard-working hairdressers and makeup artists or decorators and electricians. They've lost their income, and they'd really welcome my right honourable friend's assistance.
Brave State.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's right to speak up for the people he represents, especially small business owners who have set up their companies in particular ways, I'm sure well advised by accountants at the time on an optimal way to do that. It is fair to say that the self-employed income support scheme is expected to cover 95% of people who receive the majority of their income from self-employment. But if not, then I would recommend that those other people do look online at their potential eligibility for universal credit. We have removed the minimum income floor. That's an assumed level of income in universal credit when it comes to self-employed people. So that should no longer be considered when trying to calculate the benefits for which they may be eligible.
I now call Neil Gray, who's got 2 minutes. Neil Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. I wish to put on record my thanks to the DWP staff who are continuing to work hard to deliver social security benefits as quickly as possible in very difficult circumstances. But the circumstances have been made more difficult by the decisions of the UK government. By introducing bureaucratic support schemes instead of a far simpler universal basic payment with a longer view towards universal basic income, millions have been forced onto a still inadequate universal credit. And despite DWP staff being moved to cope with UC demand, over 200,000 people will have the UC claim paid late, according to the UK government's best estimates. Because DWP staff have been moved to help process UC claims, MPs and other advice organisations are not getting casework inquiries answered in the normal way, which is also causing unfair hardship. On the last day that I contributed in this House, on the 18th of March, before lockdown, I said people need help now, in hours, not days. And yet the people applying for universal credit that week will have only just received their first payment a few days ago. The British government must finally stop the 5-week wait. They've claimed they can't solve it by making the advance payment system a grant rather than a loan because of vulnerability to fraud. So why not make the advance a grant when the applicant is confirmed as eligible for universal credit? I would appreciate proper consideration of this proposal. Airdrie Food Bank in my constituency has reported a 47% increase in demand for their services since the onset of COVID-19. That should focus minds. And the Prime Minister said that nobody would get left behind. So why has there not been an uplift in legacy benefits like ESA as there has been to universal credit? And finally, will they scrap the immoral, poverty-inducing two-child limit, bedroom tax and benefit cap? And will they uprate all benefits to make up for the years of cuts that came via the benefit freeze? 1.7% just doesn't come close.
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions. In terms of bureaucratic schemes, I actually think government has worked at pace to introduce brand new schemes in order to protect people right across the country. We've seen the success of the job retention scheme. We've seen that the self-employed scheme is underway. And again, significant flexibility has been put into that system to help people who may not have had 3 years of earnings, to give them time to submit their latest tax return promptly to get support. In terms of universal basic income, there's a variety of analysis into this. I think the latest report I saw estimated it would cost over £400 billion a year. It is not targeted at the poorest in society. I think it's not an appropriate way for us to try and distribute money. Instead, our schemes are focused on making sure that the poorest do get help. In terms of DWP staff being moved from department to department, as I say, we have made sure that we are monitoring performances, and where there are increases in how long it's taking to process certain kinds of payments, I've made it clear to my officials that we then need to move people back. We are in this key kind of peak of payments this week, for the people who, where we have the largest uptake of applications, and I'm confident that we will get through that again with at least 90%, if not even higher, of people getting their payments on time. In terms of, I've already answered the question about the legacy benefits, why they haven't increased. In terms of making an advance, a grant, well, it comes back to the idea and the principle, Mr. Speaker, that getting an advance is effectively means you have 13 payments in a year instead of 12 to cover the annual allocation to which you're entitled. 713,000 people have received, nearly 700,000 people have received an advance, and while nearly 1.8 million people have have applied for universal credit, and those others have not sought to have an advance. So it would not actually be even fair to the other new claimants if one group of people got more money than they did simply because they'd applied for an advance. In terms of increase in food banks, I am aware of the extensive work that is going across government. In fact, my honourable friend from Colchester is involved in the task force about helping vulnerable people. I'm conscious of the increase in food bank usage and the excellent work that is going on with my honourable friend from Banbury about, as well as Camborne and trying to remember the other side of his Redruth, in making sure that we can work with them in order to make sure that food can get to people most vulnerable in society. But I would also point out, recognise the increase in food bank usage, but we've had a six-fold increase in the number of people claiming universal credit, and we are making sure we get our money to them.
We now go over to Deanna Davison. Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and join my colleagues in paying tribute to the excellent DWP staff who've been working, unprecedented hours really to try and help get the support to people in our country that need it. But this impact of coronavirus means that more people in Bishop Auckland and right across the country have been applying for universal credit. So what steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that new claimants in Bishop Auckland and beyond receive their first payment swiftly?
Well, to my honourable friend, the UC approach remains the same. We make an assessment of people's incomes, and for those people who are already on universal credit, they will have seen when their income fell substantially that their universal credit payment would have increased as a result of that. So it is working. For new claimants, Again, once they've got through that initial claim, which is straightforward, I appreciate there were difficulties early on in getting online verification, identity verification, but the process should be very smooth now. And for those people who have not got, cannot make ends meet, then the advance option is there and people can get that money very quickly.
We now go over to Stephen Timms. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Secretary of State and others in commending the Department's staff for handling the recent surge. I also welcome higher universal credit, working tax credit, local housing allowance. And it sounds from her earlier answer as if the Secretary of State agrees that job seekers allowance and employment and support allowance should have been increased as well. It's unfair that they haven't been. The unchanged benefit cap is now blocking increased support, which the government has decided people should receive. It's having a particular effect in London. It could be increased. So will the government now be more consistent in supporting people's extra costs during this crisis?
Secretary of State.
Well, I should point out to the Right Honourable Gentleman and that in terms of trying to make a short-term increase, this was gone through with the Treasury on how we could do this quickly, and the quickest ways were to increase the local housing allowance and also universal credit rather than other benefits, as I've referred to. In terms of the situation in London, I'm conscious that aspects of housing benefit regulations did go through a month ago, but not all councils have applied them. And the way that we have done something with the kind of thresholds means that people in London should be able to see an increase in the amount of money that they get when it comes to housing support. But otherwise, Mr. Speaker, it's not the intention of the government to change the benefit cap in its current threshold.
We go over to Peter Bone. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, can I follow on from my honourable friend from Aylesbury's point about directors of small companies? The government's done very well to protect people on PAYE and also done very well to protect people who are self-employed. But directors of small companies fall through the cracks, and it really isn't good enough just to say, well, they can fall back on universal credit. In many cases, they won't qualify anyway. And we protected other sectors. Secretary of State, I really think we must do better, and we must sort out how we're going to protect the directors of small companies.
State.
Well, I think to my honourable friend who will know, having been an accountant, that there will be a variety of people who receive dividends potentially from a company, and it's not currently possible for the HMRC to know whether somebody has given this themselves in lieu of a salary or whether it's a payment to an investor. So it's a different situation where people have chosen to finance their income from the business in that way, and he'll be aware that, I think I'm right in saying, the rate of tax on paying dividends is 7.5% once you go above the dividends allowance. So there is quite a difference in how people who would do a self-employed through a normal PAY scheme would again pay aspects of national insurance and tax directly. So I think that the Treasury, in devising the scheme, has sought to try and identify as many people as possible it could help, and by achieving that with 95% of self-employed people, I think that's a pretty good outcome.
Stephen Farray. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a growing support for a recovery universal basic income, and it is being considered in other parts of the world. And I would dispute what the Secretary of State has already said around the costings, and stress to her as well that this can be supported through wider changes to the taxation system. So given the current cliff edge on the job retention scheme, the danger of mass redundancies, pressures on universal credit, plus the need to inject spending into the economy to kickstart recovery, will the Secretary of State at least urgently work with the Treasury to explore this option?
State.
No, I won't, Mr. Speaker. I've already set out why I don't think universal basic income is the right approach. However, my honourable friend is a member for Northern Ireland. He'll be aware that welfare is actually transferred to Northern Ireland. So if he wanted to lobby the executive there, they might be able to devise a scheme that they think is more appropriate locally.
Chris Grayling, going over to Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I also join in thanking all the staff at the DWP and indeed the Secretary of State and her team, and particularly the staff at Epsom Job Centre, for dealing with the current crisis as effectively as they have. Could I ask my right honourable friend to look again at the issue of local housing allowance for the areas immediately outside London? There are some anomalies, particularly affecting my own constituency in Epsom Newell, and of course there will be a greater need for housing support. Could she look at the level of support and make sure it really is related to the local rental market?
Well, the local housing allowance is done on certain housing areas, and this was a significant change that the Chancellor announced in order to bring this up to the 30th percentile. What I would say to my right honourable friend is that councils across the country have been receiving discretionary housing payments. This is separate to the hardship fund, Mr. Speaker. This was ongoing, and we added £40 million to that for this financial year prior to this situation. So I would encourage anybody who is still struggling in his local area to go directly to the council for some support.
We go over to Barbara Keeley. Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During this crisis, the government has rightly stopped recovering overpayments from universal credit recipients, but they are still deducting money from those who were given an advance payment. We need the 5-week wait to be scrapped so that people don't need advance payments. But can the Secretary of State also confirm today that the government will defer any recovery of advance payments until after this crisis has passed?
State.
Well, the way that advance payments are recovered, Mr. Speaker, is by, as I say, treating this in effect as a phasing issue so that people have 13 payments every year instead of 12. So as a consequence, elements will be removed from the following 12 payments so that the annual total would be the same.
We're going over to Owen Patterson. Owen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by heartily congratulating the Secretary of State and all the staff of the DWP for the astonishing achievement of handling 1.8 million applicants for universal credit and clearing 1 million. Could I just draw her attention to those people, many of them self-employed, who were on working tax credits and were encouraged by the government to apply for universal credit, not knowing that the moment they applied for universal credit, they automatically lost by law working tax credit. They now find, some of them, that because they've been prudent, they'd set aside money for pensions, they had savings, that they don't qualify under current rules for universal credit, and they can't go back and claim for the working tax credit. Now, I've had letters from her department talking about new style employment support allowance and the new self-employment income support scheme, which are very welcome. Could she go back to those people and make it clear that they have the right to apply for these, because many of them are not accustomed to dealing with the benefit system, and they only went through this process under government encouragement.
Dave.
So first of all, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for praising staff at the DWP, and he's right to do so, and I thank him for that. I'm very aware of the issue he's bringing to my attention, and I am actively looking at that particular scenario where people not realising some of the eligibility rules have then made the application and are no longer effectively going to receive working tax credits. I cannot give an answer to my honourable friend or the House today, but I can assure him I'm looking very carefully into what potential changes we could do to address that situation. And I've already asked for the website to be updated so people are crystal clear when they apply.
We go over to Weir Hobhouse. Weir Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I also thank the staff of the DWP for their very hard work. Mr. Speaker, the hospitality, arts and tourism sector, which are vital industries in my constituency in Bath, will not recover overnight, even when the restrictions are lifted. Many of my constituents will have no options but to go on universal credit with no job prospects anytime soon. Does the minister think, and she has been even referring company directors for their eligibility of the universal credit, does she think that the current universal credit allowance of just under £5,000 per year for the over 25s is enough to live a dignified life on?
Dave.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regards to the hospitality and tourism sector, she'll be aware of the generous approach taken by the government in regards to whether it be grants, the furlough scheme, as well as other reliefs that are being applied. In terms of the figure that she quotes, that is solely the standard allowance, Mr. Speaker. There are other elements of universal credit for which people may be entitled, whether they have children, whether they have housing costs. So it is the rolling up of 6 benefits into one. She only focuses on one, and that equates currently to about £95 per week. And I think £94 per week, and I think that is a reasonable assumption, regardless of all the other costs. Disregarding the other costs.
Stuart Anderson. Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do recognise the exceptional work that the DWP is doing at this time, but I also want to applaud the work everybody in Wolverhampton is doing, from following the government guidance to caring for loved ones. What plans does my right honourable friend have to provide support for people who have informal carers who are having to shield themselves during the COVID pandemic?
Well, my honourable friend is right to praise people who've been undertaking this role. My department has introduced 2 important temporary measures to recognise changes to caring during the current emergency. First of all, unpaid carers will be able to continue to claim carers allowance if they have a temporary break in caring because they or the person they care for gets coronavirus or have to isolate because of it. And also, we've made sure that rather than just more traditional forms of care, that providing emotional support to a disabled person will also now count towards the carers allowance threshold of 35 hours of care a week. And this recognises that the nature of caring might have to change during the current emergency.
We now go over to a virtual Jim Shannon. Jim Shannon!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to ask a question. Can I thank the Minister in particular for all her energy and commitment and responses to the questions so far, and also thank the DWP staff across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and particularly Strangford, who have done a whole lot to help people. Minister, you've referred to self-employed directors in hospitality and retail and fishing and construction, bus companies. They invest their profit back into their companies as well as self-employed directors. Many of these are family businesses, creating many jobs in the high street. So, Minister, can I ask again, if you don't mind, just exactly what can be done to help the self-employed directors in shops across the whole of Newton Ards, Cumber, Ballinhinch, Saintfield, or villages across the constituency in Strangford? Thank you very much.
Seriously.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's good to see my honourable friend doing well over in Northern Ireland. I do want to stress again that the scheme that was established by the Treasury will cover about 95% of people who receive the majority of their income from self-employment. I've tried to share with the House some of the approach taken in order to support people who do only pay themselves in effect by dividends. That, as I pointed out to the House earlier, is a small percentage of people who get the majority of their income that way, and on which in effect they only pay 7.5% tax. Now, I'm conscious that dividends cannot be decided whether they're solely for effectively substitute pay or whether they are for a return on investment. But I would encourage them to consider other forms of support that may be available at this time.
We go to Jason McCartney. Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also join the acknowledgement for all the staff at the DWP who have processed 1.8 million universal credit applications? It really has been a superb effort. And also acknowledge all the support, financial support the Treasury have brought forward, including the bounce back loans today. But will my right honourable friend, as she has just said to other members, please, please, please look at what can be done to support self-employed limited company directors. And can I also add those as well that are freelancers and also those that started a new job in March and therefore can't be furloughed. There are other groups that need extra support, please.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, several of those people who are seeking support may well be able to get support through universal credit. I'm conscious that the design of the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme does not address every single worker in this country or self-employed person. I know that the Treasury worked at pace in order to get those schemes established, and they do cover the absolute vast majority of people who are now seeking support.
Go across to Emma Hardy. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I was contacted by a constituent who has a heart condition. He's also immobile because of a problem with his spine, and he's had a liver transplant. He applied for PIP in October 2019 and has still not had a reply. When I contacted the DWP, I was told that because of COVID-19, there would be delays in responding to me. But as I said, this application was from October. Now, I'm sure the Minister agrees that this is unacceptable. So what is she actually going to do to ensure that benefits are processed on a reasonable timeframe?
Secretary of State.
Well, in light of what's been happening, we have tried to streamline the process. So I don't know the details of the individual case to which the Honourable Lady refers. And I'm sure that my Honourable friend, the Minister, would be happy to look into that detailed situation. So I don't know if no assessment had been made at all, or if it was a case of the outcome was being contested. But I do want to make sure that we are not ignoring situations and new claims are still being processed. But I accept that there may be people who we need to follow up on, and I'd be happy for my Honourable friend to do that on her behalf.
Go across to Laura Trott. Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the enormous amount of support being given to business, many people are newly unemployed. What steps are being taken to highlight to them job opportunities in growing sectors of the economy?
Dave.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that we've relaunched in a way or added to the jobs website on dwp.gov.uk. There are about 58,000 vacancies currently advertised on there, but I'm very supportive of all the work that has gone on by my right honourable friend in the Department for Education on the things like the extra work that's happening on how people could get new skills, whether that's the courses that are being made available online. So there are opportunities to consider upskilling while people are sadly not working, and they can also speak to their work coaches about potential further assistance as well.
Clive Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It cannot be fair that families on the benefit cap are not benefiting from the uprating of payments that have happened during this crisis. The Resolution Foundation has predicted that a couple with 2 children in an average 3-bedroom house in over 2/3 of local authority areas will be affected by the cap. We know that COVID-19 is going to affect poorer families greater than other sections of our community. Isn't it time that we move that benefit cap to stop this situation getting worse?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as I've already said to the House, there may be claimants who could benefit from a 9-month grace period where their universal credit will not be capped if they have a sustained work record. In regards to other raises that have happened in terms of housing, there are some changes which have been made which should help people, particularly in central and outer London, but in general the principle is not to remove the benefit cap.
Go across to Hugh Merriman. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We rightly hail all of our health workers for the amazing job they're doing. It's good this afternoon that we're hearing praise for DWP staff. Down in Bexhill and Hastings, they've been absolutely amazing, as they have been across the country. When I asked my office what cases we had outstanding, the answer was 0. When I asked how the performance level rated, I was told better than ever. So on that basis, would the Secretary of State look to see perhaps if there's more discretion that we're using now that can be used in the future? Obviously, we have to keep a cost control mindset and commonality of decision making, but it seems there are positive lessons that can be learned. And can I thank her and her team for everything they've done?
State.
Well, it's kind of my honourable friend to thank DWP. I think they deserve universally credit, Mr. Speaker. But there is a situation where we are trying to learn from the streamlining that we have done about potential permanent future changes in order to see the enhanced processing that we've been successfully undertaking over the last few weeks.
Go across to Beth Winter. Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Cynon Valley suffered financial hardship and poverty prior to COVID-19 striking, with delays in universal credit, the processing of PIP applications, the child benefit cap, low wages and insecure employment. This has been multiplied by the coronavirus, with communities, individuals and businesses seriously affected. Our local Citizens Advice Bureau has been inundated with welfare benefit queries, and I thank them and all local agencies for their hard work. It is now time that the government begins to face the financial realities and hardship of people's lives. Would the Minister please agree to consider introducing a recovery universal basic income to help achieve a sustained economic recovery, and which could become the foundation for a future social security system that provides financial security for everyone?
Secretary of State.
No.
We now go across to Mark Palsey. Mark Palsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Rugby Job Centre Plus was one of the first to go to full service universal credit, and the staff there have been providing support to their colleagues in other offices. Very important at a time when registrations are running at 6 times their usual level. I know the Secretary of State will join me in thanking all of the staff for their hard work to make certain that the system runs smoothly. But I wonder if I could ask her what her assessment is of what might have happened if we hadn't taken the tough decisions to modernise and streamline the welfare system and we were still operating under the highly complicated legacy system.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say there's some unkind words. I wonder if my honourable friend is seeking his pension, judging by his new attire. However, Mr. Speaker, he asked a serious question, which deserves a serious answer. The reality is, and I've been told this by my senior officials, there is no way that the historic legacy benefit system would have been in any way able to cope with the situation that we have had. The move to universal credit has been successful, and we would still want to make sure it rolls out universally, but I think it has shown that it has absolutely stood the biggest test of all.
Go across to Amy Callaghan. Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, small increases in universal credit allowances are not enough, particularly because many people will lose that uplift due to the benefit cap. Now, I appreciate the Secretary of State has noted in previous answers that she sees no need to remove the benefit cap, but I'm seeing the need for it in my constituency of East Bartonshire. So will she review this decision and finally lift the benefit cap so people will actually receive the temporary increase in support they so desperately need?
Secretary of State.
We will not be changing the benefit cap.
We go across to Gary Sambrook. Gary Sambrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for visiting with me back in March the Longbridge Job Centre. We both saw firsthand that work coaches do a fantastic job supporting people into employment, but their ability to meet with people in person has quite rightly been restricted due to the lockdown. Can my right honourable friend update the House on the support being given to work coaches so that they continue to provide the support to claimants despite these restrictions?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the work coaches, a lot have been deployed into almost acting as processing the claims as well as the relationship with claimants. Both these things are critical to make sure that the 1.8 million people can get paid on time, and they deserve tribute to that. I think as we get over this peak, we'll be able to start to see some other work that work coaches will resume with their claimants.
Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been over 82,000 new claims for universal credit in Wales, which is unprecedented, and I echo the thanks to DWP staff. But some still are struggling to get support with their new claims, like the constituent who couldn't get through on the phone and walked 45 minutes to get help as she can't afford internet access. So can I urge the Minister to do more to make it much easier to access support with new claims, including ending the 5-week wait?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not intending to end the 5-week wait, and that's where advances can come in to help. The Honourable Lady is right to point out the difficulties people had with telephony. We've turned that system around, so now it should be more straightforward as DWP calls claimants rather than the other way around.
Harriet Baldwin. We're going over to Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join with colleagues in thanking the staff of the DWP and in particular those in West Worcestershire who've worked so hard throughout this crisis. She's been asked a number of times about the universal basic income and has resolutely rejected it. Can she confirm that a universal basic income would have to be paid universally to everybody, and that would include people like ourselves?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and that's why we know it is not a well-targeted system. So that is why we will continue to say that is not the approach that this government will take. And can I just add a belated happy birthday to my honourable friend who turned a significant age at the weekend.
We go across to Emma Lewell-Buck. Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Recently, the Secretary of State said that she was confident the system was working. Prior to this pandemic, over 8 million people struggled to access food. Now, a further 8 million households with children have lost their income. With food banks reporting increased footfall of over 100%, can she please explain what possible grounds she had for this misplaced confidence and her continued justification for the 5-week wait for universal credit, 2-child policy and the benefit cap?
Secretary of State.
Well, the fundamentals of the universal credit do not change, and the reason why there is an assessment period is to understand people's general incomes and make a basis from that. But this is where the advances come into help for people who cannot make ends meet in between. As I say, fewer than half of people who have applied for universal credit have also wanted an advance. I think that shows that, given that we're getting the vast majority of that money to people within 3 days, that the system is flexible enough to help those who need it most.
Go across to Ian Liddell-Granger. Ian Liddell-Granger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has made it very clear how the system is working. It is working well. But I wonder if the Secretary of State could take a chance to perhaps address some of the issues with self-employed people who are still waiting for money from the announcement, and perhaps reiterate some of the rules and also the way they're going to be paid over the next few months. I think it would be useful and helpful to let people understand just what the government is doing to make sure they are looked after and paid for the long term.
State.
Well, my honourable friend will be aware that 80% of people's profits are going to be reimbursed to self-employed people through the form of a grant. I know that the system was going to take some time to deliver. My understanding is that payments will start to be paid within a month, but in the meantime, there may be people who are currently self-employed who could seek support from universal credit in between.
We go across to Anne McLaughlin. Anne McLaughlin.
Mr. Speaker, I was horrified to discover that, contrary to the announcement that PIP recipients would be entitled to a 3-month extension, my constituent, a lone parent with severe mental health problems, will not be. Why? Because, as the PIP hotline confirmed to my caseworker, if your award was decided by a tribunal, in other words, if you were forced to fight the DWP for that lifeline, that entitlement, you will again be treated differently to all other PIP recipients, and the 3-month safeguard won't apply to you. Can this seriously be true? And if so, why?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I set out, Mr. Speaker, for people who were due to have a reassessment, that is where the situation would arise where we were going to extend the award automatically by just 3 months. People who are in a tribunal process are those who have challenged the decisions and therefore the question of what award they have received will be the one that is under debate and review.
We'll go across to Christian Wakeford. Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that coronavirus has seen the loss of loved ones in many families across the UK. Can my right honourable friend tell me what steps are being taken to ensure widows, widowers and their families are being supported, and what improvements are being made to bereavement benefits for widows and widowers?
Secretary of State.
Well, bereavement support payments does support working age people who lose a spouse or civil partner after the 6th of April 2017 by contributing to the more immediate additional costs associated with bereavement. And people without children get an initial payment of £2,500 and 18 subsequently monthly payments of £100. Those with children receive an initial payment of £3,500 and 18 subsequent payments of £350. Bereavement support payment is not taxable, and the least well off will gain the most as they receive the payment in full alongside any other benefit entitlements.
Go across to Dan Jarvis. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mental and physical health conditions should not be a barrier to finding work. And that's why, working with the Department for Work and Pensions, we launched Working Win, an employment programme that has now helped 3,000 people across South Yorkshire. So can I ask the Secretary of State if she recognises the value of programmes like Working Win? And will she commit to providing funding to support our most vulnerable workers through the COVID-19 crisis?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Department supports a number of different schemes around the country. I'm not aware of the one to which the Honourable Gentleman specifically refers. These will continue, I'm sure, to be supported more broadly, but each and every one will be evaluated because we need to make sure that the money that we do have has the best reach, and I'm sure that he will continue to lobby for that case in South Yorkshire.
Go across to Anthony Higginbottom in Lancashire. Anthony Higginbottom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that there remains confusion about who can and cannot go to work, and I receive questions every day about whether any given company is essential, and if it isn't, whether it should be closed. Could I therefore ask my right honourable friend what steps she is taking to make the current guidance clear and any future guidance, and make a suggestion that some kind of public information campaign is considered?
State.
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this. Our communication has been very effective about staying at home, but we've also said from the very start that people should try to work from home, but if they cannot, then they should go to work or are able to go to work. But further advice will be coming from government in the coming weeks to employers and trade unions on how to make workplaces safer. We have set out how work must be done in the workplace, including tailored advice for different scenarios, as an example of how social distancing and other measures might be implemented by employers to help protect their workforce and customers. And we continue to learn from each other, including in this House.
We go across to Dr. Rupert Hurt. Dr. Rupert Hurt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to hear that the Minister is fixing some of the glitches in universal credit, a system that many of us thought up to now was woefully inadequate. And we do have what will be maybe the biggest unemployment increase since the 30s on the way. But can I ask her to consider it in the round and do two small things to relax the savings threshold, because many people losing their businesses are finding that prohibitive. And also, could she replenish some of our reservoirs for housing, discretionary housing payments in Ealing, because at a time when a housing crisis was already underway in Ealing, Acton and Chiswick, it is only getting worse.
Secretary of State.
So in terms of the question about self-employed, where people have assets that could be, say, savings set aside for paying tax or similar, then I think that they need to be checked carefully and go through that as they make their claim, because these will not be considered as being part of savings in regard to the £16,000 threshold. In terms of housing, we have increased the LHA, and I'm sure that the discretionary housing payments have gone to Ealing Council, and it is open for councils to come back to central government if they would like this to be raised substantially.
Go across to Mark Harper. Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear from what the Secretary of State said, both in her statement and in answers to questions from other members, that universal credit has been much more effective at scaling up to deal with the unprecedented level of claims arising from the coronavirus pandemic. So, and I know from my own constituency experience, we get half the number of problems than we did with the legacy benefit. So can I use this opportunity to thank all of her staff, including those in my own constituency who delivered universal credit, and may they continue to do so.
I thank my honourable friend for that. He is right. The old system would not have coped with what universal credit has actually stood up and helped over 1.8 million people making that claim.
Go across to Kate Ossamore. Kate Ossamore.
Thank you for calling me to speak today, Mr. Speaker. May I remind the House that back in March, when I wrote to the Secretary of State asking what emergency measures were in place to allow the department to cope with the increase in new universal credit claims, I was told back then, and the Secretary of State has repeated today, that her department would be redeploying staff and reviewing priority of work. But I'm afraid to say that months into this crisis, I still have constituents being told the waiting time is 8 hours when calling the claim line. As a result, many are being forced to use food banks for the first time. So given the ongoing issues my constituents are experiencing, will the Secretary of State give her highest priority to resolve the technical and capacity issues being experienced by giving clearer guidance to both the public and to the hard-working DWP staff regarding the correct process to make digital and non-digital universal credit claims?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did have telephony issues. I'm led to believe that these have been significantly addressed, particularly with the Don't Call Us, We'll Call You campaign. Can I recommend that if she wants to communicate to her constituents, that she consider asking them to use the journal where necessary? I appreciate not all of them have internet access, but now the average waiting time should be considerably lower, and the last I'd heard it was on average about 5 minutes. So please do look into that.
We go across to Andy Carter. Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I add my thanks to the DWP team based particularly in Warrington, who've helped to process claims swiftly for people in my constituency over the last 6 weeks. On Friday, I visited Warrington Food Bank to meet the volunteers who are working hard to support families who've fallen on difficult times in my constituency. One of the concerns they raised is the speed of recovery when universal credit is advanced. Now, does my right honourable friend agree that ensuring anyone who receives an advance to their benefits is given a reasonable time frame to pay this back?
Secretary of State.
Well, the advance is currently recovered over 12 months, so somebody in a year will get 13 payments instead of 12. I should also point out to my honourable friend that also any deductions made in that way are made at a maximum of 30% of the UC payable, and that will help several people as well.
We now come to the penultimate question, Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Many people have had to apply for universal credit for the first time, but it's clear that despite DWP staff working hard, the system simply can't cope, and it was never intended to operate under such extreme circumstances. Constituents are waiting weeks for DWP phone calls, and those unable to verify their identity online are told the application doesn't exist, therefore they can't query it. So what is she doing to prioritise new claims for universal credit, many of which are from people who have paid money into the system for decades, and now you find that their contribution means next to nothing?
Secretary of State.
I don't agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think UC has reacted very well to the increased challenge. But what I would say to him is that there were initially problems with the online verification. There's an additional scheme called Confirm Your Identity. But between that and Verify, it should be very straightforward for people to get through that part of the claim. But can I assure him he can also arrange for constituents to contact the DWP helpline and be processed that way too.
Final question from Sir Desmond Swain.
What increment in expenditure has the Treasury provided her department since the onset of this coronavirus?
Secretary of State.
Well, our new estimates have been published, I believe, today or tomorrow. So I will refer my honourable friend to that particular element in terms of delegated spend. But overall, we estimate about £6.5 billion increase in welfare benefits for the nation.
I suspend the House for 30 minutes. 5:06 p.m. It may be helpful to tell the House I propose to continue with 30-minute suspension from now, but may review the timings in the future. Order, order. Thank you, everybody.